Okay, so first things first, let's go ahead and talk about some of the different supplies that you need to build and paint miniatures. First thing to start off with, let's talk about some of the basic supplies here. We have a pair of snippers here to help remove models from the various sprues you have. And I also have an X-Acto knife that helps to also remove models from the sprue, but also to help clean up the model. A little bit later, I'll go ahead and show you exactly what I mean by that. And then I personally use Loctite super glue to assemble my models. It works for plastic, resin, metal, any kind of material that you might come across. Some people like to use Testor's plastic glue for um, plastic miniatures, or Tamiya's super thin glue for plastic miniatures, and so forth and so on. Loctite's super cheap, and you can get it pretty much anywhere at any hardware store or on Amazon or anything like that. So it's always readily available. And if I do make a mistake when I assemble miniatures, it's very easy to correct that mistake. The next thing after the miniature side of things, the assemblage, we have our various brushes. There's a lot of guides and videos on the internet that swear by certain brushes, certain sizes, certain brands, and so forth and so on, that can create a lot of confusion and a lot of headaches. So let's go ahead and kind of talk about that for a moment, and brushes and what you should buy and what you should look for. You can get paintbrushes pretty much anywhere. You can get them from Walmart, you can get them from Michaels, you can get them from Hobby Lobby, you can get them from Magelings, and they all have their various pros and cons. What you're really looking for is a paintbrush that has a good tip on it. For example, this paintbrush here has a very nice round and pointed bristles. This allows me to go ahead and keep paint onto the brush, but also help get it to where I need to go. As your brush ages, you'll notice that it'll start to fray and not keep the point as well. Currently, I conditioned my Army Painter brush to have a decent tip on it, but I've noticed over a little bit of time, the bristles have a tendency to kind of flay out, and that makes it very difficult to paint detail. And then there's other brushes that I typically use would be kind of like this. It's just a makeup brush. I use it for dry brushing, which is a technique that we can go over later. And dry brushing is very hard on your brushes. So I like to go kind of cheap on that route. So you'll see on internet forums and miniature painting forums that brushes like Kolinsky Sable, Opus Operandi, or whatever brand it's called off the top of my head, I can't remember, are the best brushes and best brushes that you could ever have, and they last for years. That may be true, but the brushes themselves can be upwards of $20, $30, $40, $50 a piece. So as a way to get started, don't worry about buying the expensive brushes. Go to Hobby Lobby, get some cheaper brushes, as long as they have a tip, and just practice. Don't worry about price, or synthetic versus sable, or any of that right now. You just want to make sure that you have a brush to use and learn from. You could also, some of the other brushes that you can get are made specifically by like Games Workshop or Army Painter, and those aren't terribly expensive. They're decent brushes, but I highly recommend getting a set of cheap brushes to begin with, just so that way you can practice and learn, because you're going to make mistakes. I still make mistakes. I've been painting for over 20 years and I make mistakes all the time. So let's not worry too much about the brand name of the brush or what it's made out of. just get a brush with a decent tip and just kind of start going from there. So our next thing is to talk about the different paints. There are so many different kind of paints out there. There are so many different brands, colors, things, different paints that accomplish different tasks even. So first things first, what you're gonna wanna do after you have your miniature assembled is look for a primer. For example, I have a primer here. This is just Rust-Oleum 2X Ultra Cover matte black that I picked up at the hardware store. You can pick up Games Workshop makes different colored primers. Army Painter, and I believe there's another brand out there too. Each of these things can be carried at Mage Links Games. Or if you go my route, Rust-Oleum, and I prefer Rust-Oleum just because it's cheaper and more, and the quality is more consistent. You'll be pretty much good to go. There are multiple different kind of primers. This one, for example, says 2X Ultra Cover. That means it's a little bit thicker, so when you apply it, just be careful. There are different color primers. You have black, white, gray, red, and they come in a wide variety of colors, and it's always best to choose the color primer that you want that will best suit your model's needs. And we can go over that a little bit later. I went ahead and picked out a small selection of some of the different Citadel Games Workshop brand paints that I have on hand. I've got a ton of them, but there's a very small selection. Now, like I said, there's a lot of different kind of paint brands out there. You can get Citadel, Vallejo, Army Painter, P3, and then when you get more into the hobby, you'll discover even more brands, but these are some of the basics. So I recommend going with Games Workshop at first. They seem to be a little bit easier to handle. There's a wide variety of colors, and their paint line is a little bit less intimidating than, say, like Vallejo. P3 is also a great, another great company, and they're kind of reminiscent of like the old Games Workshop paints from like 20 years ago, but we can get into that later. So Games Workshop makes a variety of different kinds of paint. So right here I have Citadel Layer Evil Sunz Scarlet. A layer paint is just something that you use to go over like your prime or your base coat. The Citadel does make like base paints. Those are thicker, and we can talk about that a little bit later. I personally don't like the base paints because they can be so thick and they do require a lot of thinning. So your layer paints though are kind of like your middle of the road paint. You know, it's not too thick, it's not too thin, doesn't do that. It's just middle of the road paint. Next up we have contrast paints. This one here is Blood Angels Red. The goal of a contrast paint is to go directly over your prime. And I'll show you the different models that have been primed in a moment. It goes directly over your prime. Games Workshop suggests that you use their spray primer. I believe they have two different kinds of spray primers. One of them is like Wraithbone, and the other one's like Gracie or Gray. The gray tone and a kind of like a warmer, like almost like a bone color. And that's meant to go directly, the contrast paint is meant to directly go over that primer. Realistically, as long as your primer has like a satin finish, the contrast paints will work just fine. And they're super thin. You don't want to put too much onto the model, but they're nice and thin, and they're great for people just starting out, or even great for people like me that have been doing it for a long time, and it's just another tool in my toolbox to help get miniatures to the way I want them to be. Your next basic kind of paint category is shade. This is Citadel's Nuln Oil. Sorry, that took me a few moments to get out. Nuln Oil shade. And what that does is it provides kind of like a shadow effect. This one specifically, like it's a darker tone that's very, very thin, that's meant to get into the recesses of your model to create shadows. It's a very handy trick. I like it. I've got several different kinds of shades that I use for my models, and they're wonderful. The last one are Citadel Technical Paints. Now these are a little bit more of a specialty. There's a wide variety of these two. For example, I picked out Citadel Color Technical Tesseract Glow. And that's kind of like almost like a bright neon green color that people have been using for their Necron models, for plasma glow, for any kind of like really cool glow effect. This is really good for. It's a bright neon green when it's finished. It goes on very similarly to a shade or a glaze. But there are other technical paints out there that produce different effects. Another one that I like to use is called Typhus Corrosion, and it's this really weird kind of a shade with like bits of grit in it. And when that goes on, it creates like a really like gross corroded effect. And I'll go ahead and talk to you about that a little bit later. I did almost forget though, the number one tool that you're gonna need. This is a paint pot. It's to store my water for my paint, to clean my brushes, for color changes, for the end of the day. I've had this one forever, and realistically you wanna have a dedicated paint pot so that way you're not constantly going through plastic cups or your own glasses that get covered in paint. And you want to make sure too that it's easily identifiable from all your other cups. I've almost done it one time, but I've heard of plenty of other people doing it where they accidentally get their coffee cup mixed up with their paint pot and get a nice swig of paint water instead of coffee. It's gross. Make sure that it's make sure you know which cup you're going for. So now that we kind of went over some of this stuff, let's go over some of the things I talked about with your miniatures. I went ahead and created a few different examples of your miniatures, kind of like a work in progress. First, I have a miniature still on its sprue. It can, depending on the miniature, the sprues can be huge, they can be very complex, they may not be complex. For an example, I just have a Space Marine Intercessor Sergeant. Here's his body, the main body, his back, his one arm, his head, and his other arm that holds the bolt rifle. Each kit comes with an instruction guide on how to assemble them. So this is what it looks like. For the next model, I have, off of a very similar sprue, I have an Intercessor Space Marine model, and I did not go ahead and clean up any of the extra sprue bits or mold lines on this to kind of show what I'm talking about when it comes to this. So for example, on the shoulder pad here, you can see this raised area. That's a little bit of sprue that's still attached. And using your handy dandy X-Acto knife, you can go ahead and remove that. Because I'm on camera and I don't feel like, bleeding, I'm not gonna do it right now, but I just wanna show these different examples. This is part of your sprue, which you can clean off. And it helps assembling a little bit easier too, because you'll notice that in between some of these arm points and helmets down here, you have bits of sprue and they need to line up pretty well. And if you keep those in there, your model's not gonna line up and you're gonna see a lot of different gaps. Here's another bit of sprue that was left on. And I'm looking for a good example of a mold line. A mold line is created when the two pieces of plastic during the molding process press together. So you'll see like a little seam. Space Marines, it can be like down the shoulder pad or down the leg. And what I typically do when I find them, or even up here is a good example, is I take the back of my X-Acto knife, which is not sharp, it's pretty dull, and I go ahead and I just lightly scrape them away like this. You'll see them go away pretty quickly. There are other tools that are sold to help remove mold lines. I've never had a problem with the back end of my X-Acto knife. So once you have your miniature assembled and cleaned, you want to go ahead and prime it. This model is another Space Marine that I've had for way too long. Was primed using the Rust-Oleum 2X Black. What you want to do with that is make sure that you're kind of far enough away so that way you don't completely lose any of the detail when you're priming. A black primer is typically good for when you want to have your models be a little bit darker in tone overall. As you notice when you play around a little bit later, you'll notice that your black prime will produce, even when you have other colors over it, will kind of produce like a darker almost effect. Some colors work really well over black primes. All your darker colors will work really well over black prime. Your lighter colors will not. They just kind of get streaky and weird. It's best to always go from, if you're going to go dark and work your way up gradually to a lighter color. The next model I did was I primed gray. It doesn't look all too different from the model that you just assembled, but you'll kind of like feel it a little bit, and it feels a little bit more satiny, and gray primes are the best neutral thing you can do. When you want, gray is a neutral color. If you want to go dark, you want to go light with your color scheme, you're good to go. You can go anywhere with a gray prime, and most people recommend starting off with a gray prime. The last model, I primed white. White is a very difficult color to use in general. White primers, I've noticed, can be kind of chalky or runny, or just a little bit more difficult to use, so I use them very sparingly. In fact, this is probably the first model I've ever primed all white in 15 years. It turned out pretty okay. Thank goodness for that. And if you prime white, you're typically going to have a very light colored model. I used a Stormtrooper as an example, and I mean, all I have to do now to finish up a Stormtrooper is just paint a couple of spots and, you know, hit it with that Nuln Oil wash and a little bit more, and it's essentially finished. So that is our first introductory video into getting into the hobby. One of the best things that you can do is, if you decide to get into miniature painting, you know, there's a lot of different models, a lot of different kits out there that are related to games. Some of them aren't related to games. There's a wide variety out there. Once you select kind of what you want to paint, whether it's Star Wars, Legions, if you want to be an Imperial player or a Rebel player, the next step is to figure out your color scheme. That can take a little while. That can take some trial and error, but Magelings Games does have quite a few employees, and Columbia, Missouri specifically has a great community that is always willing to help out with people just getting into the hobby and answering questions that anybody may have, and being just very supportive. So if you need help selecting a color scheme, you know, feel free to ask. If you know, the staff at Magelings is available. Magelings has a Discord There's a Facebook group called Wargaming Columbia, Missouri, not South Carolina, whoops, that is very supportive and is very welcoming. And like I said, any questions that you may have, we can go ahead and answer those and help you through the process of getting started. Hopefully this is the first of many videos that we decide to do. The next video that is being planned will be kind of more what to do after you get your model primed. And we can start that shortly over the next couple of weeks, but we'd also like to institute kind of like a monthly or bi-weekly or whatever we decide upon, like live video class. So anybody who's interested, please let us know, so that way we can go ahead and try to schedule the best time that fits everybody's schedule. All right, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed this talk.